So how do you convince millions of people to essentially rewrite their own history, redefine their entire national identity, and then view their neighbors as an existential threat? I mean, you don't start by passing a sweeping law, right? You don't even start with like a charismatic politician at a podium. You actually start with a 19th century fiction novel.
Right, which sounds totally counterintuitive. But when you look at the actual mechanics of how, massive ideological shifts happen, they almost always begin in the cultural groundwater, like way before they ever reach the ballot box.
Yeah, and that groundwater is exactly what we are wading into today on this deep dive. We're looking at this sweeping, like 3-decade spanning analysis by historian Tanika Sarkar. It's her book, Hindu Nationalism in India. And just to be clear, this isn't a recap of modern political headlines.
No, definitely not.
We are looking for the architectural blueprints of an ideology. We really want to understand how a defensive cultural reaction under British colonial rule basically evolved into the daily habits, the living rooms, and, the school curriculums of modern India. Like, how does majoritarianism become normalized as just common sense?
Yeah, that's the core question. And before we get into the mechanisms that Sarkar identifies, we should probably just lay our cards on the table regarding the source material.
Good idea.
We are unpacking some highly charged political and religious history today. It involves intense social conflicts, competing narratives, and as guides through this material, we are not here to take sides or endorse any of the political or religious viewpoints we're discussing.
Right.
We're just impartially examining Sarkar's historical and ethnographic analysis, the structural how and why of it all, exactly as it's presented in her work.
Exactly. We're looking at the engine, not voting for the driver. And Sarkar starts her analysis of this engine with a really fascinating concept, which is the invention of a mythological framework. So this takes us way back to 1882, under British colonial rule, to a novel called Anandamath by Bankimchandra Chattopadhyaya.
Right. So to give some context, Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva, was initially emerging during this period as a kind of defensive posture. It was against both Western liberalism and the historical legacy of Islamic political power in the subcontinent. And Sarkar, she doesn't treat Anandamath as just a story.
Okay.
She views it as a performative speech act. It was this attempt to, speak a unified Hindu nation into existence before the political reality of that nation was even possible.
What's wild to me about this novel is how it takes a real documented historical event and just fundamentally distorts its DNA to invent a new foundational myth.
Yeah, it really does.
Because the novel is based on the Sanyasi-Fakir rebellion of the 1770s. But in reality, that was a catastrophic period of agrarian distress. I mean, you had a massive famine combined with brutal economic policies from the East India Company. And peasants, both Hindu and Muslim, were just starving and rebelling together.
Right. It was a complex, messy socioeconomic tragedy. But Bankimchandra takes that shared misery and he reframes it entirely. In the novel, the famine and the rebellion are basically stripped of their complex colonial economics, and they're transformed into this Manichaean struggle.
And let's unpack that term really quick, because it's crucial here.
Yeah.
A Manichaean worldview isn't just your basic, good guys versus bad guys trope.
No.
It's the belief in an absolute, cosmic battle between pure light and pure darkness, where a compromise is literally impossible.
Precisely. So the novel takes an event that killed millions regardless of their faith and reframes it as a specifically Hindu catastrophe caused entirely by Muslim tyranny. The Muslim rulers become the singular absolute manifestation of evil, and the Hindu ascetics, they become the pure warriors of light.
Wow.
And Sarkar argues this wasn't just some clever way to hide anti-British sentiment from colonial censors, It was a deliberate ideological intervention to give a narrative shape to a new communalized nationalism.
And to anchor that narrative, you need a powerful central figure. You need a deity. Bankimchandra essentially invents the goddess of the motherland, Farat Mata, using the, modern tools of print and the literary market. And the psychology behind how this goddess is constructed is brilliant. She is split into 3 sequential forms representing the past, the present, and the future.
Yeah, this tripartite structure is deeply resonant. The past is represented by the goddess Jagadhatri, and she symbolizes plenitude, the clearing of forests, the benevolent mother providing endless food. This really taps into a profound nostalgia for an imagined, pure, pre-colonial, pre-Islamic golden age.
But then you snap back to the reality of the 19th century reader. The present is represented by Kali. She's terrifying. She symbolizes starvation, loss, and a reversion back to the dark, untamed jungle. It completely validates the reader's sense of present degradation and victimhood.
which perfectly sets up the psychological need for the future form, which is Durga. But Sarkar notes this isn't the traditional Durga.
Oh, really?
No, this is an imperial, demon-slaying martial figure encompassing might and glory and wealth. Her explicit purpose in the novel is political mobilization. She literally commands her children to wage holy war to restore the Golden Age. So unlike ancient deities, this motherland goddess doesn't have an organic ancient mythology. Her entire reason for existing is to serve as the divine authorization for a political project.
Though I guess it's worth noting the text isn't just a flat political pamphlet, right? I mean, Sarkar points out deep internal tensions in it, like moments of ordinary human desire and love that chafe against the strict demands of this holy war.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's even a paradox where the novel portrays the arrival of the British almost as a providential divine intervention necessary to stop Muslim rule. It just shows how complicated and contradictory colonial modernity actually was for the writers who were trying to navigate it.
Totally. So the foundational myth was laid down. You have the rewritten history, the new martial goddess, the defined enemy.
Right.
But a 19th century literary blueprint, it only goes so far.
Right.
To build a mass movement, you have to find a way to physically recruit people into that framework and weave it into their daily lives. You have to recruit the family unit.
Which means you have to recruit women. This is where Sarkar's pioneering fieldwork comes into play, specifically her study of the Rashtra Savika Samiti, which is the women's wing of the RSS. So in 1991, India was in the grip of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which was this massive, intense agitation aimed at building a temple in Ayodhya.
And up until this point, the ideology had largely confined women to the domestic sphere. They were idealized as passive, pure symbols of the culture. But the sheer scale of the 1991 agitation required bodies in the streets. Suddenly, women were mobilized as militant activists or karsavikas. They were out organizing, they were courting arrest, and driving the public momentum.
The mechanics of how they were mobilized are fascinating, particularly the use of audio cassettes. Like the speeches of Sadhvi Vifambar were distributed everywhere. Sarkar describes her vocal delivery in these tapes as shrill, breathless, just a high-pitched harangue with no modulation, just constant extreme stress.
Because the medium became an integral part of the message. If a politician stands on a stage and delivers a measured, logical argument, you process it rationally, right?
Right.
But if you are sitting in your living room and you hear a shrill, breathless voice crackling through a cassette player, it doesn't sound like politics.
No.
It sounds like an emergency. It sounds like a mother screaming that her house is on fire. It bypasses rational debate and triggers a visceral nervous system response. The technology allowed that raw panic to be mass-produced.
That actually raises a huge contradiction, though, because you have women breaking out of traditional domestic roles, going into the streets, participating in intense political agitation. On the surface, if a woman leaves the house to lead a protest, you might look at that and say, well, that's a form of feminist emancipation. They are claiming political agency.
And Sarkar heavily cautions against reading this as feminist emancipation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she points out that the empowerment these women were experiencing remained strictly enclosed within and ultimately served a traditional patriarchal framework. The militancy was never directed at dismantling patriarchy or demanding equal rights in the home or the workplace.
Okay.
It was framed purely as a state of emergency, like a temporary mobilization to defend the Hindu home from an external threat.
So they are permitted to be warriors, but only to guard the gates of the patriarchal structure, never to redesign the house itself.
Exactly. And their organizing structure really reflects that. The Samiti operates through these capillary home-based networks. Women visit each other's homes, they build relationships with entire families over decades, and organize small neighborhood gatherings.
It reminds me of those multi-level marketing setups, like a Tupperware party.
Oh, yeah.
You are using the most intimate, trusted network you have, your neighbors, your friends, your living room, but instead of selling kitchenware, you are quietly embedding a highly specific political ideology over tea and snacks. It's molecular. It operates completely beneath the radar of formal political rallies.
It really does. It anchors the ideology in the domestic sphere. And we see how deeply entrenched this domestic focus is when we look at what happened a decade later. Because when Sarkar revisits the Samiti in 1999, the political landscape has totally shifted. The political wing, the BJP, has taken power at the national level. The street agitations have died down, and Samiti membership in Delhi has literally halved.
Well, because the state of emergency was over. Once you win the election, you don't need the massive street militancy of women anymore. In fact, If women get too used to that public power, it might threaten the traditional social order you're trying to build.
Yes. Sarkar identifies this as a strategic repositioning. The political wing had to make pragmatic compromises to govern and build coalitions, so the women's wing was pulled back into the home and assigned a new role. They were to be the uncorrupted guardians of ideological purity. They were tasked with maintaining the pure essence of the movement, away from the messy compromises of electoral politics.
But to convince women to willingly retreat from public power back into the domestic sphere, you have to harden the ideology around the home. Sarkar calls this the fundamentalist turn. The leadership began explicitly campaigning against the concept of individual rights.
They framed individual rights, and particularly women's rights, as a destructive colonial import designed to shatter the Hindu family. When speaking with Sarkar, leaders insisted we are not homewreckers. They positioned feminists who advocate for equality as the true enemies of culture. We see the ultimate expression of this and their furious campaign to ban Deepa Mehta's 1996 film Fire, which depicted a romantic relationship between two women.
Yeah, they denounce lesbianism as a Western perversion. It just highlights a profound hostility to any sexual or social nonconformity. The underlying message is that a woman's agency is only celebrated when it serves the broader political project. The moment it manifests as an independent demand for rights or personal desire, it becomes a threat to the nation itself.
And if the ultimate duty of a woman is to protect the cultural and biological purity of the community, the movement inevitably has to police who she falls in love with and who she marries.
Which creates the perfect bridge into the love jihad narrative. This is the political campaign targeting intercommunity romantic relationships, specifically between Hindu women and Muslim men. It dominates modern headlines, but Sarkar actually traces the roots of this specific anxiety about Muslim male sexuality all the way back to the 1920s.
Yeah, and the internal logic of this narrative is remarkably consistent over time. First, it assumes that Muslim men are inherently predatory, meaning any affection they show a Hindu woman is, by definition, coercive or deceptive.
Right.
Second, it shifts the goalposts of the relationship from romance to demographic warfare. The claim is that the ultimate intent is to convert women and fill their wombs with Muslim children to slowly eradicate the Hindu majority.
The demographic panic is the loud part of the narrative, but the quiet part, the psychological mechanism actually making it work, is the complete infantilization of women. I mean, the entire campaign rests on the assumption that an adult woman is basically a perpetual child.
Exactly.
Just utterly incapable of making a rational choice about her own romantic or sexual life. She is framed as a helpless victim of a grand conspiracy, which then gives her family and the men in her community the moral authorization to aggressively survey, control, and sometimes violently intervene in her life to protect her.
The woman's body becomes the literal battleground for national demographics. But Sarkar offers a brilliant analytical pivot here to reveal the hidden political utility of this narrative. She compares the social reaction to Hindu-Muslim marriages with the reaction to intercaste marriages.
This is the aha moment of her analysis, because conservative society also fiercely punishes intercaste marriages, particularly between a higher caste woman and a Dalit man.
Right, but as Sarkar points out, those intercaste relationships do not generate massive, coordinated national political campaigns. The outrage remains completely localized. Why?
Why, yeah.
Because the love jihad narrative serves a macro political function that punishing caste mixing does not. The Hindu community is historically fractured by deep, systemic, and often violent caste and class divides. By conjuring a terrifying external threat, the predatory outsider coming for our women, the movement manufactures a besieged solidarity.
It bridges the internal fractures. You look at a lower caste neighbor you might otherwise oppress, and you say, we have to put our differences aside because the outsider's at the gates. It used the policing of women to build cross-caste political unity. But to ensure that unity survives across generations, you can't just rely on fear-mongering adults. You have to weave these narratives into the foundational reality of children.
And that brings us to Sarkar's 1994 fieldwork, studying the Vidyapati schools, which is the vast educational network run by the RSS. This is where the ideology moves from political rhetoric to daily pedagogy.
And they don't do this by throwing out the state curriculum. The kids still learn the standard state syllabi so they can pass their board exams and succeed professionally, but they envelop that standard education in a highly specific ideological environment.
Yeah, they supplement the state curriculum with mandatory courses on Indian civilization, where history, geography, and culture are thoroughly Hinduized. But the most powerful conditioning actually happens outside the textbooks. The schools themselves are referred to as mandirs, or temples. The walls are covered in maps of Akhand Bharat, which is an undivided India that claims the territory of neighboring sovereign nations. And they have portraits of the movement's early ideologues.
The physical environment normalizes the political goals. Even the way a child experiences a birthday is rewired.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the Western tradition of blowing out candles and cutting a cake, students celebrate by singing devotional songs. It strips away secular or globalized cultural markers and replaces them with a uniform religious identity from a very young age.
The objective is a seamless ideological circuit. A child moves from a conservative family home into this deeply structured school environment and then often into an RSS shaka, or daily training branch.
Right.
There is zero cognitive dissonance. They are surrounded by the exact same worldview, the same pantheon of heroes, and the same defined enemies at every hour of the day.
I can hear a skeptic listening to this and thinking, wait a minute, India is a developing country with massive disparities in public education. If an organization comes into a neighborhood and offers a structured, disciplined school where kids learn respect for elders and cultural pride, are the parents really signing up for an ideological project, or are they just desperately trying to get their kids a safe, reliable education?
It is a totally valid point, and Sarkar acknowledges the genuine appeal of the discipline and community these schools provide. The state's failure in education absolutely creates the vacuum they fill.
Sure.
However, Sarkar insists we must look at who specifically is being invited into these schools. In her study, the social base was overwhelmingly petit bourgeois and upper caste. There was a conspicuous absence of non-Hindu or lower caste students in these particular environments.
Okay. So while it provides discipline, it also preserves social exclusivity. It gives that specific upper caste demographic the cultural confidence to compete with the English-educated metropolitan elite while reinforcing their superiority over marginalized groups.
Right. And preserving that elite upper caste hierarchy connects directly to the historical roots of Hindutva thought. When Sarkar traces the intellectual evolution of the movement from the 1920s to the 2000s, a consistent through line emerges. It's a deep-seated opposition to modern democratic values of equality and social justice, which are frequently branded as alien Western corruptions.
This starts with V.D. Savarkar's 1923 text, Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? Savarkar's massive ideological innovation was shifting the central axis of Indian politics. During the freedom struggle, the axis was colonizer versus colonized, but Savarkar worked to change that axis to Hindu versus Muslim.
Exactly. By defining the nation purely through religious and cultural terms against an internal other, Sarkar argues Savarkar successfully obscured other pressing material problems, namely British colonialism, severe class inequality, and the oppression of the caste system.
Yeah.
He offered a narrative of shared Hindu blood that provided a theoretical equality, but practically left the rigid internal social hierarchies untouched.
And that theoretical equality vanishes entirely when you read the post-independence writings of M.S. Golwalkar, who led the RSS for decades. His vision for the state is genuinely shocking to a modern democratic sensibility. I mean, he explicitly rejected parliamentary democracy, universal adult franchise, and the very concept of equality.
Golwalkar was remarkably candid. He called for a literal return to the Varna Vyavastha, the hereditary caste-based social order. He praised monarchy as a superior institution to democracy and viewed the democratic, secular Indian constitution as a fundamental mistake. And Sarkar stresses that these were not the ramblings of a fringe member. This was the guiding philosophy of the movement's most prominent leader.
But there is a massive practical problem with that philosophy. You cannot win elections in a vast, diverse, universal democracy by promising to revoke voting rights and enforce the caste system. You need the votes of the very people that ideology seeks to subjugate.
Which necessitates a tactical evolution. This was orchestrated by Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who introduced the doctrine of integral humanism. Sarkar analyzes this not as a change of heart, but as a necessary rebranding. Upadhyaya smoothed over Golwalkar's extreme anti-democratic rhetoric to make the movement viable in electoral politics.
Yeah, he replaced the abrasive calls for caste hierarchy with the soothing, neutral-sounding language of social harmony.
Exactly. The framing changed, but Sarkar argues the core objective remained the same: preserving traditional caste and class hierarchies without overtly alienating the lower caste voters they now desperately needed.
But if your underlying ideology believes in the inherent supremacy of a specific social group, and actual evidence-based history doesn't support that supremacist narrative, you have to engineer your own past. You have to weaponize history.
This forms the basis of Sarkar's most devastating critique. For this movement, history is not an academic discipline rooted in cross-checking sources or verified evidence. History is a claim to formal knowledge designed purely to exalt a political mission.
The history they teach is entirely reverse-engineered to justify the politics of the present. Sarkar notes that early historical writings by figures like Savarkar were essentially strings of bold assertions presented as absolute truth without relying on standard historical evidence.
Right.
The singular goal was to paint a continuous, uninterrupted narrative of Hindu-Muslim conflict, framing Hindus as perpetual victims who must constantly arm and mobilize themselves.
And the inspirations for this historical worldview were often alarming. The sources detail how Golwalkar drew explicit inspiration from Nazi Germany, praising their purging of the Semitic races as a model of national pride that India could learn from.
Unbelievable.
And this admiration for aggressive majoritarianism wasn't confined to the past. The text notes a chilling detail from 1998 where a youth camp for the ABVP, the student wing of the movement, was officially named Blitzkrieg.
Wow.
They recognize that India is phenomenally diverse, with countless localized indigenous and tribal traditions. The ABC goes into these marginalized areas and systematically collects local myths and tribal deities. Then they forcefully fold these distinct local stories into grand, upper caste Brahmanical narratives.
Yeah, the example in the text is taking a specific local tribal legend centered around snakes and declaring, well, actually, this isn't an independent story. This is just a localized version of the myth of Ganesha.
By doing this, they present a newly unified, authentic history. The sociological mechanism here is profound. It absorbs marginalized groups into the broader Hindu nationalist fold, giving them a sense of participation in the great nation. But crucially, it erases their independent cultural identity and keeps them subordinated to the Brahmanical center. It is inclusion without equality.
And while the RSS is executing this massive, organized rewriting of history at the village level, what is the academic establishment doing? Sarkar directs some very sharp criticism at her own colleagues in the academy for failing to counter this.
She describes the academic landscape as a battlefield where secular historians are effectively losing touch. She points a finger specifically at postmodernist historians.
Okay.
Postmodernism often relies on cultural relativism, the idea that objective truth is an illusion and all history is just a collection of competing subjective narratives. Sarkar argues that while this might be an interesting theoretical exercise in a university seminar, in the real world, it accidentally provides massive cover for RSS myths.
Right, because if the academic establishment declares that all history is just a subjective narrative, they hand a loaded gun to political extremists. The extremists can just turn around and say, great, if truth is relative, then our narrative about a glorious, pure past and a demonic enemy is just as valid as your peer-reviewed evidence. The academics essentially dismantled the weapon of objective truth that was desperately needed to fight the mythology.
Furthermore, she critiques leftist historians for remaining confined to elite metropolitan audiences. They often just swapped out old colonial binaries for new academic ones, failing entirely to communicate with the grassroots. While the academics were debating theory in English-language journals, the RSS was actively building the new common sense in local vernaculars, in schools, and in living rooms.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the synthesis of this entire project. How do you fuse faith, history, and the nation into one indivisible entity?
Sarkar concludes that Hindutva has successfully redefined the very nature of Hinduism for its adherents. The nation itself is elevated to an object of religious worship. Ancient epics are fundamentally reconfigured. The Ramayana, traditionally understood as a complex mythological and moral epic about duty and a battle against a demon king, is flattened into a literal historical account of a war against Muslims.
But Hinduism is famously decentralized, right? I mean, it has thousands of distinct deities, philosophical schools, local sects. How does a political movement enforce a single, unified national religion over that kind of massive diversity?
By maintaining a rigid core beneath an illusion of openness. We saw how they absorbed tribal myths. They will gladly celebrate the inclusion of lower castes at massive political rallies to demonstrate unity. But Sarkar argues that the fundamental religious and social hierarchies, which are governed by upper caste Brahmanical norms, are fiercely protected. The unity is strictly political, but the social hierarchy remains stubbornly unequal.
Now, we've spent this time walking through the architecture of this movement entirely through Sarkar's analytical framework. But to give the listener a complete picture, we need to examine the lens she is using and look at the critical reception of the book itself. Because Tanika Sarkar approaches this history from a very distinct left secular and feminist academic standpoint.
Yes. Her entire analytical machinery is built to examine material power structures, class conflict, and patriarchal control. She is always looking for the structural reasons behind an ideological shift.
And what are the blind spots of that specific lens? Like, what are the main criticisms of her work?
Well, from a structural perspective, the book is a compilation of essays written over 30 years. It doesn't have the seamless, unified narrative arc of a book written all at once. An essay capturing the immediate raw heat of the 1991 agitations reads very differently than a retrospective analysis written decades later.
That makes sense.
Additionally, because of the time frame of her research, the book misses several massive drivers of the modern movement. It doesn't explore the profound financial and ideological role of the Indian diaspora. It largely misses the weaponization of social media and WhatsApp. And it doesn't fully account for the overwhelming hegemonic electoral success of the movement post-2014. Her expertise is the grassroots, not the mechanics of the modern digital state.
Let's challenge her core arguments directly, actually, using the tensions present in her own fieldwork. I want to look at how she views women. Sarkar insists the Samite women are ultimately just tools of the patriarchy, guarding their own gilded cages. But the text also shows these women articulating very modern aspirations. They want education, they want careers, they are traveling, they're learning martial arts, they are running complex organizations. If we look at this objectively, isn't there a strong counter-argument that Sarkar's strict feminist ideals are blinding her to the reality of these women's lives? I mean, for a conservative woman in the 1990s, leaving the house to lead a political rally is a massive expansion of personal agency, even if she uses conservative language to justify it.
That is a very potent critique of her feminist framework. A critic could absolutely argue that by insisting true empowerment must look like secular, liberal feminism, which demands the total dismantling of traditional structures, Sarkar minimizes the actual lived experience of her subjects. The women she interviewed clearly felt empowered, confident, and vital to their communities. A devil's advocate would argue that finding leadership, respect, and mobility within a conservative framework is still a form of genuine agency, and dismissing them simply as victims of false consciousness does them a disservice.
And we can apply a similar challenge to her view on caste. Sarkar repeatedly asserts that the movement is fundamentally an upper caste preservation project, and that any inclusion of lower castes or tribal groups is just a cynical tactical trick. But the electoral math doesn't lie.
Right.
BJP and RSS have successfully integrated tens of millions of lower caste and tribal voters into their base. They couldn't wield national power without them. Is it possible Sarkar is so committed to viewing them as upper caste manipulators that she fails to see how the ideology has genuinely adapted and become porous?
Again, a highly valid counterargument. The sheer scale and durability of the movement's expansion among non-elite and subaltern groups suggest a complexity that goes beyond mere upper caste manipulation. If millions of marginalized people are finding a compelling identity, physical security, or a political voice within Hindutva, dismissing their participation as just being tricked by a Brahmanical narrative risks stripping those voters of their own political rationality. A critic would say the movement is much more socially adaptable than Sarkar's rigid class analysis allows her to admit.
But even with those blind spots and valid counterarguments, the impact of this work is undeniable.
It remains a masterclass in the study of grassroots authoritarian populism. Sarkar didn't just sit in the university reading speeches by politicians. She spent decades in the field, talking to the people involved, dissecting the mundane, daily mechanisms of how an ideology physically reproduces itself. It is essential reading if you want to understand how majoritarian movements build enduring power anywhere in the world.
We started this deep dive by asking how violence and majoritarianism become common sense. What Sarkar's work reveals is that it never happens overnight. It's not a switch flipped by a single election. It happens slowly, through the pages of a rewritten 19th century novel. It happens through the visceral panic of a cassette tape passed around a neighborhood in the 90s.
Yeah.
It happens through women chatting in their living rooms, deciding who is an outsider. And it happens in the way a 5-year-old child is taught to celebrate their birthday at school. It is a slow, methodical, molecular rewiring of a society.
And that leaves us with a profound and perhaps deeply unsettling final thought. Sarkar's analysis proves that history isn't just a static record of what happened in the past. History is the raw, moldable material for whoever wants to control the future. If a political movement can successfully equate questioning their specific version of history with betraying the nation itself, What happens to the very concept of truth? I would encourage anyone listening to look back at the history you were taught as a child, regardless of where you grew up. Ask yourself, how much of that curriculum was based on rigorous evidence, and how much of it was actually just a quiet initiation into a specific political identity?
That is the question to sit with. The mechanisms of ideology are always operating just beneath the surface, in the stories we tell and the routines we accept. Keep questioning the narratives, keep staying intensely curious, and keep unpacking the world around you. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.